Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 266. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have news on the war in Ukraine, including looking at who actually wants this war to come to an end and why some NATO members don't. I want to start off here by just thanking everyone. We just finished our fundraiser at the Libertarian Institute for this spring, and it went great. We hit our goal, and thanks to supporters of this show who contributed, it is keeping this show and all the work I'm doing at the Institute, including the writing almost daily news articles, along with the roundup now that I've been putting out. So for everybody who donated, thank you so much for supporting what we're doing. And those kind of donations make possible the Libertarian Institute going out to Freedom Fest this year. And so I think that's July 13th through 16th. Myself, Sky Horton, and others from the Institute are going to be in Las Vegas for that. And then I have a couple other events I want to mention just coming up pretty soon now. May 4th, I'm going to be speaking in Denver at the Liberty on the Rots event. You can find that information at the Liberty on the Rots Facebook or Twitter handle. And then, I'm speaking on Ukraine there. And then that next weekend on the 7th, I'll be in San Antonio for an event for the show's sponsor, Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com. Promo code PEACE, that saves you 20% when you spend $75 or more on their fantastic high-quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. The owner of Paloma Verde, Carlos Ablar, it is the one-year anniversary of his podcast, Los Libertinos, and so for Paloma Verde and the show, I will be out there in San Antonio, and I think there's quite a few other people going, including Buck Johnson. It's going to be an absolutely great event that I'm sure if you're a listener of this show in the area, if you want to go, let me know. I'll get you in touch with Carlos, and we could figure out how you could attend the event. And then the end of May, that last weekend, I will be at the Libertarian Party convention in Reno. I'm not speaking or anything, but I would like to have some time with any listeners of the show who will be there. So if you listen to the show, you're going to be at the Libertarian Party convention, hit me up, let me know, and I'm going to try to put together a little get together with some show listeners and maybe a couple of the other guys from the Institute who are going to be at that event. All right, with that, let's get into the show today. The first article I have is by Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute. NATO states seek to prolong Ukraine war to weaken Russia, Turkish foreign minister says. And so this is in line with the Washington Post article that me and Will wrote on last month. And, this same theme that NATO members want to drag on this war in Ukraine, fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian to bleed Ukraine, just like they did to Afghanistan with Operation Cyclone in the 80s. So Will writes, some members of the NATO alliance favor continued bloodshed in Ukraine over peace, believing that the conflict will diminish and weaken Russia. The Turkish foreign minister said. The diplomat outlined Ankara's stance on the war during an interview with CNN Turk earlier this week, stating that Turkey would continue to press for a negotiated settlement after hosting several rounds of talks between Moscow and Kiev. He said other states in the NATO bloc do not share the same goal, however, instead seeking to drag out the fighting in order to harm Russia's longer-term interest. There are countries within NATO that want the Ukraine war to continue. They see the continuation of the war as weakening Russia, he said. They do not care much about the situation in Ukraine. And I believe this is not from the article, that today on Sunday, April 24th, the Turkish President Erdogan is either meeting with or speaking with Zelensky. And so this could be productive and gain some kind of negotiation done, because it has been Turkey, probably more than any other state at this point, that has pushed for some kind of end to this conflict. Back to Will's article here. While the foreign minister did not cite any country by name, his comments follow similar reports that several NATO members are reluctant to see an end to the war, opposing any outcome that could be presented as a victory for Russia, even if it means Ukrainians continuing to fighting and dying. The foreign minister went on to say that Turkey would continue its efforts at diplomacy and would not join Western-led sanctions campaign against Moscow, arguing that his country, in its unique position, given its closer ties with both Russia and Ukraine. It is important here that we continue our diplomatic contacts with both sides. Turkey is needed here. We are a country that both sides trust. He continued claiming that Western countries understand our decision not to participate in the sanctions. However, during an interview with a local media outlet earlier this month, the foreign minister said Ankara will be forced to follow should the United Nations impose sanctions on Russia. Turkey abides by international law, he said. Asked about whether Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is acting under the guidance of Western states, the foreign minister disagreed, saying, "We cannot say that he is the head of a state under their control just because he is needed outside help." Though Zelensky has repeatedly urged allies to commit to a security guarantee for Ukraine akin to NATO's Article 5 provision, the idea is yet to be accepted by any nation. The Turkish foreign minister said that while Turkey does not oppose the concept in principle, he observed that the terms of this guarantee are not clear, suggesting that Kiev must offer a more detailed plan before partners will agree to any defense pact. So this interview from the Turkish foreign minister, I think, is really important, and as Will has in his article here, for a couple of reasons. One, we're looking at the unique position of Turkey, which we have talked about on the show since even before Russia invaded Ukraine. That Turkey was one of the countries in this unique position, and how the U.S. has treated Turkey throughout this, not by allowing Turkey to really act in this diplomacy role, but rather by pushing Turkey to take more of a militaristic side, even by apparently encouraging, at one point, there was a U.S. official encouraging Turkey to transfer its Russian-made S-400 missile defense system to Ukraine and then buy or receive free the U.S. Patriot aircraft system, anti-missile defense interceptor system. That's what the S-400s and the Patriots do. And so, of course, who knows that this would actually make a big difference on the battlefield, but it would make a big difference for Moscow, Ankara, and their relationship and how that would play out in the long run. It would obviously erode the trust that Moscow has in Ankara and make it, I think, more difficult for any kind of negotiations mediated by Turkey to go forward. And so the U.S. has been looking to undermine the relationship. The other country that is in a similar position, but I think not as much, like Turkey, I think, has been more the negotiator and the diplomat mediator here than has Israel, but Tel Aviv is also in a similar position. There's a lot of people in Israel who have, become Israeli citizens that were from the USSR and, major, places they came from were either Russia or Ukraine. And so, there's that historical background there that's helpful. And also Israel just looks to maintain a relationship with all countries, especially major world powers. So they've maintained that relationship with Russia. And of course, Ukraine is in that Western orbit sphere. And so, Israel's the other country in this position. However, it seems that Israel is starting to take more and more of a stance, and this has led Russia to coming out and condemning Israel. And so with Tel Aviv less in that role, it puts even more pressure on Turkey to maintain that position because it is important for negotiations to happen to come to some kind of settlement. Now, I think, one of the biggest issues is here, as Will points out in the article, is there are NATO member states who don't want this war to be negotiated in a way that Moscow can present a victory. And this is just the most absurd standard. If you look at the two countries, Russia has more relative power than Ukraine does, not just in size and population and GDP and military capability and nuclear weapons. For all these reasons, also, just historical influence in Ukraine and all that, it seems very unlikely that even, I think in the long run, that the people of Ukraine would be willing or, enthusiastic for any kind of deal that completely was a loss for Moscow, because some of Moscow's interest in Ukraine are about the ethnic Russian or the Russian speaking people of Ukraine, the people of the Donbass, the Crimea, which is I think now Russian, but at the same time, they claim it's not. And so I think the only way this war ends is for the people of Crimea, which have voted to join Russia, the people of the Donbass, which want to be separate from Kiev because of Kiev's anti-Russian policies. That there's really not controversy here that Ukraine, since 2015, has adopted strictly anti-Russian laws. Laws that have targeted the Russian language. Even movies by that star Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that were in Russian, movie titled Love in the Big City 2, was banned by the Ukrainian government under the cultural and language laws. In Odessa, of course, in 2015, there were dozens, scores of I can't even say pro-Russian, but anti-Maidan revolution, government coup protests that went out there that were burned alive by some of these, extremist ethnic nationalist militias that exist in Ukraine that target the minority groups, including the Russian people. And so, to say that none of these concessions can be made, doesn't even really, I think, reflect the will of the Ukrainian people. Now, things have changed a lot in Ukraine in the past 2 months with the invasion by Russia. I think, probably even among the people who are either ethnically Russian or Russian speaking, they may be less inclined to be ruled by Moscow now. But again, some of Russia's demands here are about Crimea, which wasn't invaded by Russia. It's just annexed by Russia, and then a referendum of the people there backed it. Same with the Donbass area that Russia has been protecting, right? These people want to either be a part of Russia or an independent state that's a protectorate of Russia. And so, the NATO members are going beyond even what some of the people of Ukraine, would want here. But anyways, Russia is the stronger party to this war. And so the idea that this would end in some kind of way where Russia isn't at least able to declare some victory on some issues is just a completely absurd expectation that will guarantee that the war never ends whatsoever. All right. Next up, I have an article at antiwar.com from April 22nd. NATO and Russian military presence in Mediterranean Sea at Cold War levels. The U.S. is seeking domination over the Mediterranean Sea as tensions with Moscow mount. NATO and Russia have built up their forces in the region to the most significant level in a generation. French military communications officer in the Mediterranean Sea said Ukraine has changed things. The Americans are back. This hasn't been the case since the Cold War, he added. Russia has doubled, if not tripled, its military capacity in the area. The French military official estimated Russia has 20 ships in the Mediterranean. He says the U.S. has moved warships from the Atlantic Ocean to double its presence in the sea as well. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, NATO was operating with 3 aircraft carrier strike groups in the region. 3 weeks ago, the U.S. extended the deployment of the USS Truman aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean. Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro said last month that the Truman's current role could allow it to be used as a weapon for another state. The role of the Truman, this is Del Toro, with other allies is to deter Russia from further aggression and to be on constant standby for orders that might be given from our president or from other leaders around the world for the protection of Ukraine and the people of Ukraine. In addition to the massive naval presence, NATO has stepped up its intelligence gathering. The French Atlantique 2 spy planes are deployed to Crete to surveil the sea. A NATO military official speaking with AFP said the purpose of the deployment was to show Russia that the Eastern Mediterranean Sea is a NATO area. So that is the NATO goal. It's domination of the Mediterranean Sea and also of Ukraine, as you know, we've been talking about. Next up here, I have another article from antiwar.com. Russian generals suggest Moscow could seize Ukraine's entire coast, linked to Transnistria, and this is a area of Moldova that's in separatist breakaway region. So, a Russian deputy military commander said Moscow could seize Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast to create a corridor to a breakaway region in Moldova. On Friday, Rusman Minikiv, acting commander of Russia's Central Military District, said control over the south of Ukraine is another way to Transnistria, and where there is also evidence that the Russian-speaking population is being oppressed. Now, he didn't present evidence of this, and this is an area that, after the fall of the USSR, as Moldova is becoming its own, country, this region that's divided from the rest of Moldova is like a narrow, thinner strip of land. Pretty long though. The population is 500,000 people. Has been self-ruled. Now, it initially gained that self-rule with protection of the Red Army and has since had about 1,500 Russian peacekeepers to help maintain that situation. And so I'm not sure if there's any real reason that Russia is concerned about this territory now, and they're now looking to create this corridor that would link Russia proper through the Donbass, Crimea, and then Odessa, the Black Sea coast of Ukraine, all the way to Moldova. However, there could be a strategic advantage to that, assuming militarily that would definitely be the case. And maybe Russia, with the current military actions, just saying, well, while this is going on, we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, it's unclear that if this military commander was speaking on a way to represent official Kremlin policy, or was just speaking. So let me get into that, because I think that this is maybe a little bit important here. One possibility that I could see is that Russia is maybe looking really to just take territory in eastern Ukraine around the Donbass, and so Ukrainian troops being in Odessa, Kiev, Lviv, and other areas in the north and the west of Ukraine would be advantageous for Russia, who isn't looking to carry out a genocide in Ukraine, but is looking to take territory. And so the less Ukrainian forces that are there, the less people that you got killed to take that territory. And so just, from that, utilitarian interest, that they could have interest to try to wage any kind of information campaign they can to hold Ukrainian forces, to get the government in Kiev to have any kind of incentive to hold Ukrainian forces in Odessa, because if they're in Odessa, they're not in the Donbass, and that's better for Russia. Now, that could not be the case at all, and Russia really could be looking at taking Odessa and the Black Sea coastline. I've said since the start of the conflict that I really thought Russia would take the Black Sea coast and make Ukraine a landlocked state. Just from a strategic position, it seems like such a victory to do this. It would be surprising if Moscow didn't go this far. Now, there's all kinds of costs and consequences to trying to take Odessa and this other Ukrainian territory, and it could cost a lot of Russian lives and a lot of Russian money and everything like that. But I would imagine that there are people within Russia's military establishment who just, are kind of looking at it from a chessboard position and saying, boy, having this territory would be really important to, say, stopping smuggling, getting into Ukraine, and then having, again, a way to bypass Ukraine entirely for Russia to get to the rest of Europe and to get to other, heavier Russian populated areas that are, different breakaway regions and protectorates of the Russian state. Russia, by the way, does not represent that breakaway, does not say that that breakaway area of Moldova is Russian territory or its own country. The only, I think, entities in the world that I identify that as its own independent sovereign area are some of the like South Ossetia and another area that is another kind of in a similar position. So just to wrap up here, the other possibility again is maybe this is internal politics within Russia, just like in the U.S. different officials are more hawkish than the president, and it just varies. And so this could be just some military commander kind of not maybe completely speaking out of line, but just giving his own opinion and trying to move the political needle within Russia. All right. So this from Dave DeCamp on April 21st. Putin says Mariupol liberated, calls off assault on the steel plant. And so there's been a few thousand Ukrainian soldiers at a steel plant that's absolutely huge. It's, much bigger than any factory that I've ever seen. I lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and there was a old engine factory, I think from Chrysler, that was like 4 or 5 blocks long. It was seriously like almost a half mile or mile long building. This building, I think, stretches far bigger than that. There's tunnels underground in it and everything. So this is a major portion. It's not just like, the local factory that a couple hundred people are hauled up in. But even with that, Putin is saying that, Mariupol has been liberated. I guess conquered is probably a little bit of a better word to use than. But, that is the way that Russia is going to frame it. Now, there's been some thoughts around potentially having a ceasefire, allowing these people to leave. But I really don't know what the status of that is. And from what I could tell, both Moscow and Kiev seem to be waging a little bit of information war when it comes to this area. Now, the Donbass region of Ukraine, as I'm sure most of my listeners know, is two independent republics. One is the Donetsk, and then the other is Luhansk. Luhansk is the northern one, and right now, the Associated Press is reporting that 80% of that Luhansk territory is now controlled by Russia and their, I don't want to say proxy force, but the Luhansk government's militia military that is largely backed and supported by Russia. I believe Russia probably a month ago, or maybe last 3 weeks ago, said that they had controlled about 2/3 of this territory to 70%. So that probably signifies some small Russian gains, but it does kind of say that that number that Russia put forward is probably somewhat correct that the AP is reporting it. Now, let's refugees real quick. So millions of refugees being created. I think now the civilian death toll is over 2,000, and several thousand people injured by Russian strikes as well here. But the refugees are now moving into Germany and Britain, where both of those states are looking at getting rid of some of their other refugees, particularly Afghan refugees, in favor of the Ukrainian ones. And it's a terrible situation, right, to have all these different refugees from all these conflicts created by the West. And I certainly understand and not in favor of large welfare states or anything like that. And, government-sponsored population redistribution, it typically does not go well and is not, for the best of anybody, not the people of the home country, not for the people being redistributed in this planned way. However, shipping off people from a war of victims of a war of aggression waged by the West, in favor of now these Ukrainian refugees who are the political darlings of the moment is pretty disgusting, and just goes to show how little all these governments actually care about human life and how it's all just political and about making a good show at the time. All right, now let's talk about how the West is, actually helping the government in Kiev, and that's all militarily. Biden announces $1.3 billion in additional aid for Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp, April 21st at antiwar.com. On Thursday, President Biden announced another 1.3 billion in aid for Ukraine. Of that amount, 800 million will go towards a new weapons package, and 500 million will go directly towards the Ukrainian government for economic assistance. The 800 million in military aid includes howitzers, artillery rounds, vehicles to tow howitzers, and the newly developed, specifically for Ukraine, known as Ghost drones, which the Pentagon says have similar capability to Switchblade drones. According to the Pentagon, the package includes 72 155 millimeter howitzers and 144,000 artillery rounds, 72 tactical vehicles to tow the howitzers, 121 Phoenix Ghost tactical unmanned aerial drone systems, and field equipment and spare parts. The new package brings the total military pledged by the Biden administration for Ukraine since Russia invaded on February 24th to a whopping 3.4 billion, including direct economic assistance given to Ukraine. That aid climbs to 4.4 billion. And then the U.S. had also authorized about $1 billion in military aid since the start of the Biden administration, but prior to the invasion. So it's about $5 billion of our taxpayer dollars now in the pockets of the very corrupt government in Kiev. The U.S. started sending howitzers to Ukraine as part of a separate military aid package that was announced last week, providing the heavy artillery marks an escalation in U.S. aid for Ukraine. And then just today, the Sunday the 24th, Zelensky said that the U.S. was and Western countries were finally sending Ukraine the kind of aid and forces that it needed. Then Dave wraps up here saying the U.S. and its NATO allies will continue to pour weapons into Ukraine despite warnings from Russia to stop. We had the White House National Security Council spokesperson, I believe is his role, Matt Miller, telling MSNBC last week that the U.S. was always preparing the next arms package. Now, a little bit on these ghost drones. Dave has an article about what they are. Pentagon says U.S. rapidly developed new ghost drones for Ukraine. The Pentagon said Thursday that the U.S. Air Force has developed a new type of drone for Ukrainian forces known as the Phoenix Ghost, which was included in the $800 million arms package. This rapidly developed by the Air Force in response specifically to Ukrainian requirements, John Kirby, who's the Pentagon spokesperson, told reporters. The only detail Kirby offered about the Ghost is that they are similar to the Switchblade drones that the U.S. has been given to Kiev. And Switchblades are either called suicide or kamikaze drones. They have explosives mounted on them. They're not like the Reaper that will drop separate missiles. The drone themselves are the missile, but the U.S. has been sending a lot of those Switchblades along with the Javelins and Stinger missiles to Ukraine. So let's see. I think that's most of what I had from myself or Dave or Will's articles on weapons transfers. I do want to add that Germany is subsidizing Slovakia's arms transfers to Ukraine by sending tanks or other military equipment to Slovakia if they send their Soviet era stuff to Ukraine, because that's what the Ukrainian troops are more familiar with. Last week, the Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby said Ukraine was getting fighters from some other European country. It wasn't the United States, but it was a NATO member state. So who knows what actually they're getting and what kind of aerial equipment. They're also getting spare parts. So it could have been that maybe some state is sending them helicopters and then they're getting spare parts for their MiG-29s or something like that. But we just have vague details about what's going on there. And then, let's see. The U.S. is hosting military talks in Germany this week about the situation in Ukraine. They sent out 40 invites, but they're only expecting 20 people to show up, in 20 countries, not people to show up. And with that, one important thing is the West has portrayed this as it's the world united against an isolated Russia, and that's really not the case. Now, to some extent, NATO has been isolated, although, this hasn't extended, to every last country, and there's different level of enthusiasm, including if you look at like especially Hungary or Turkey, which are NATO member states, but have, attempted to at least remain somewhat balanced in all this. So, it certainly isn't the world united against. And then, having only 20 different countries show up says that that's not even every NATO member state that's going to be there. And then Zelensky, I believe, but some top Ukrainian officials said that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken would be in Kiev today, Sunday, April 24th. So I'm guessing on a later show this week, I will have some details about that visit, whatever they pledged, however it went. And if it materialized, because sometimes, the dates of these things has to change based on risk. This is a country at war, and the U.S. sending its Secretary of Defense could be seen as a major provocation. And so it wouldn't be impossible, I hope, for something like that to be walked back. All right, now let's talk about sanctions and international relations and things like that. We have this article from myself and Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, April 21st. Russia slaps travel ban on 29 Americans, including Harris, Stephanopoulos, and Zuckerberg. The Russian Foreign Ministry announced a travel ban on 29 Americans, including Vice President Kamala Harris, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, and ABC's George Stephanopoulos, and the presidents of several American arms companies. The Foreign Ministry statement said the travel bans were in response to an ever-expanding anti-Russian sanctions under which the Biden administration brings an increasing number of Russian citizens, both officials and their families, as well as representatives of business circles, scientists, and cultural figures. That was from the Foreign Ministry statement. Moscow says the 29 Americans were selected because they promote a Russia-phobic agenda, having already sanctioned a number of senior officials in the White House and most of Congress. Washington has levied sanctions against its own several top Russian officials, including President Vladimir Putin and his daughters, as well as hundreds of lawmakers in the Federal Assembly. The U.S. government is also working to eliminate trade with Russia, announcing that Russian ships would no longer be allowed in American ports on Thursday, following a flurry of previous economic penalties. This side note, last week, Greece seized a Russian oil tanker, saying it was violating European sanctions on Iran. Now, it's unclear where Germany got this information. I know there's some of these neoconservative groups that say they track Iran trying to disguise its oil tankers to sell oil around the world. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it came from one of those groups, but it's unclear exactly how this happened. But then Greece ended up releasing the ship at the end of last week, saying it was some kind of mistake. Back to the article here. U.S. officials and spouses on the Kremlin stop list include First Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hitz, Vice Chairman to the Joint Chiefs of Staff Christopher Grady, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby, White House Chief of Staff Ronald Klein, White House Cabinet Secretary Evelyn Ryan, and Ryan is Sullivan's or Blinken's husband, and then the other one, whoever that isn't, and then Counsel to Attorney General Margaret Goodlander is the spouse to the other one. Second gentleman, husband of Kamala Harris, Douglas Emhoff, State Department spokesperson Ned Price, Deputy Minister of Health Rachel Levine, and as well as Robert Kagan, the husband to Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, but Kagan is a rabid neocon in his own right. Zuckerberg was among a series of American businesses executives targeted by Moscow, Along with other social media platforms, Zuckerberg's Facebook has allowed posts supporting the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion. After Russia invaded Ukraine, breaking with its typical harsh policies against racism and extremist groups, the militia faction was absorbed into Kiev's military following previous hostilities in the Donetsk region in 2014. And me and Will Porter wrote up this pretty close to the start of the invasion that Twitter was allowing a Azov Battalion post that showed soldiers dipping bullets in pig's lard to shoot at what they called Muslim orts. And then on Facebook, they were specifically allowing the group that had been listed on the violent and hateful group that list that Facebook has, and they took them off. So or were temporarily allowing support for that group anyways. So along with Meta, the heads of Northern Grumman, General Dynamics, Huntington Ingalls, L3 Harris Technologies, AeroVironment, Leidos, Booz Allen Hamilton, Aerojet, Rocketdyne, and LinkedIn were barred from entering Russia. And then in addition to Stephanopoulos, several other U.S. thought leaders were targeted from the foreign policy blob, including journalists and think tankers such as David Dupata, Matthew Cronin, David Ignatius, Edward Acevedo, Kenneth Rothrock, and Brianna Valentavina Gold Riga, who I think she works for CNN. I'm not exactly positive, and sorry about butchering a bunch of the names in there. So anyways, those are some of the sanctions from Russia on U.S. officials. The U.S. has, of course, announced new sanctions on Russia. And while in Serbia, Senators Jean Shaheen, Chris Murphy, and Tom Tillis advocated that Serbia levy sanctions on Russia as well. It's not just the sanctions on Russia, though. It's this overall policy of we won't talk and are shunning all Russian officials, to go along with Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen walking out of a G20 meeting once Russian officials started talking. Officials from G7 countries walked out of a meeting at the World Bank once Russian officials started talking. And I mean, this just seems juvenile. What's the point of it? It's not like his words are going to hurt anybody, whatever this Russian official is saying. It's not like by sitting there, you're endorsing or promoting what the Russian official is saying. That's how diplomacy works. Both sides talk. They are supposed to listen to what each other say and try to come to a compromise. The fact that the West is saying that we can't even talk with Russia or be in the room with Russian officials at all is creating a great divide in the world, and this is going to be a real issue. The West is putting themselves in no position whatsoever to walk this back, as I started off the show talking about, by saying that Russia cannot have a victory with any kind of negotiated settlement. It is not the way that diplomacy works. You have to be allow your opponent to be able to spin victories, even if you don't view them as victories. You have to allow your opponent to be able to spin that victory for their own domestic political reasons, to incentivize everybody to not only sit down at the table to negotiate and to have some kind of deal that could work, but also that all parties are incentivized to making sure that the deal gets implemented. Look, in 2015, there was a Minsk II agreement between Russia, Germany, France, and Ukraine, and particularly Ukraine never implemented this agreement, and that is a big part of what ends up leading to the Russian invasion, along with potential NATO membership, the positioning of strategic missile launchers in Eastern Europe, overall NATO expansion, and the aggressive Western policy towards Russia. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. I got a bunch of great stuff coming up this week. Dave DeCamp will return to the show. Of course, Connor Freeman will be back on, and I'll continue. I will make sure I do at least one show this week covering non-Ukraine stuff, just because there's so much other stuff, important stuff happening in the world. However, this whole Ukraine issue is, of course, talking about this big divide, that the new Cold War zone that we're entering, and also the massive pile of nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia sit on. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Share the show if you can. Everybody, thank you so much for supporting the Libertarian Institute fundraiser. So high, it's high. We hit that goal. And oh yeah, along with all the events I have coming up, I should tell everybody that every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to be the guest on the Misty Winston show on TNT Radio. So, regular radio spot every week there, and talk about all my articles that Misty wants to talk about. So, thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll be back with more shows later in the week.